I'm Sarah Butcher, and this is the Side Comment. In this episode, Jorge Daniel Taillant explains the causes and effects of glacial melt, as well as the actions nations across the globe can take to address glacial melt and work towards slowing the effects of climate change.
Climate change is happening all around us, and one of the telltale signs is melting glaciers. I'm Jorge Daniel Taillant, author of the recently published book Meltdown: The Earth Without Glaciers. We hear about it almost daily. Pieces of ice the size of continents breaking off of Antarctica or melting away in the Arctic region. But we might ask, does it really matter? Will melting glaciers so far away from us change our lives? Absolutely. The Earth goes in and out of ice ages through glaciation and deglaciation cycles that last about 100,000 years. These cold and warming cycles have to do with the shape and tilt of the Earth's orbit around the sun and how cold or how warm the Earth's surface gets as a result. When it's cool enough, glaciers form. This planetary ice-making system creates glaciers by sucking water out of the oceans and converting it into snow. And as that snow falls on colder regions of the planet, large glaciers are formed. It takes about 80,000 years to create a full-fledged ice age, when there can be a mile of hard, thick ice over all of New York. Because massive amounts of ocean water are used to make these glaciers, the sea levels fall. During peak ice age, a state like Florida grows to over twice its current size as the waters of the ocean fall and the coastlines expand. Then, 5 times faster than it took to make, in over 20,000 years, the ice melts away as water gushes back into the ocean, flooding coastal lands. New York's ice cover disappears, and Florida shrinks to its smallest size as the tide comes in. Much of South Florida, including all of Miami's urban sprawl, disappears and becomes underwater coral. The difference in sea level during peak ice age and the wettest and warmest periods of deglaciation is about 600 feet. Think about that for a moment. The oceans rise and fall vertically with each ice age cycle, about the same height as 2 city blocks stacked one on top of the other. We are now at the end of a deglaciation period, but we still have about a third of the way to go before all glacier ice melts, if it does. And if it does, the oceans will rise, and they will rise a lot. By how much, we could ask? Well, the bridge in San Francisco, the Golden Gate Bridge, the really famous one? The San Francisco Bay will rise so much under full deglaciation and sea level rise that the water of the bay will reach the roadway of the bridge. Such sea level rise at a global scale would cause tragic floods to millions of acres of land in cities like Amsterdam, Buenos Aires, Shanghai, Bangkok, and even Washington, D.C. And this would displace hundreds of millions of people. Melting glaciers also cause reflectivity changes to the Earth. Glaciers are white, while oceans are blue, and land has many hues of greens, yellows, and browns. And just like wearing a dark shirt on a very hot day, dark land heats up because it absorbs much more heat than the white surface of glaciers. And that's what causes land to heat up and the climate to warm. Melting glaciers also affect water supply. But you would think that if glaciers melt, then we would get more water and that farmers, for example, would be happy. It's not quite that simple. Rapidly melting glaciers accelerate river runoffs too rapidly, and that erodes the Earth, and that can destroy river ecosystems and everything around them. And as glaciers melt, furthermore, their surface area shrinks, and that actually decreases water supply over time. Melting glaciers also create dangerous structural instability, since glaciers are often perched up really high on mountaintops. As the climate warms, the ice structures weaken, and large pieces of ice the size of entire buildings or even small cities can suddenly come crashing down, transformed into massive land, rock, and ice slides that can suddenly collapse on ecosystems below them. These are what I call glacier tsunamis. They can take out everything in their path. Here's another one. Have you heard of invisible glaciers? Yes, literally invisible glaciers. There's a little-known realm of the cryosphere called the paraglacial environment. That's a world of invisible glaciers creeping through the subterranean of our coldest mountain ranges. You could be standing on hundreds of feet of thick, cold ice, and you wouldn't know it. You wouldn't see white snow or ice for miles around, but it's there. These glaciers have a name few people have ever heard of. They're called rock glaciers. Even most glaciologists know very little about these mysterious glaciers that are protected by a thin surface cover of rock debris. Rock glaciers, because they're protected by this cover, will survive beyond the life of visible glaciers and the initial impacts of a warming climate. But also lurking in the subsurface of our cold areas of the Earth is permafrost, or permanently frozen grounds. Permafrost can be high in organic content, and that's because rotting trees or plants trapped hundreds or thousands or even millions of years ago when ice ages formed are beneath the surface in this frozen ground. As permafrost melts, due to this warming climate, thawing, decayed organic matter releases methane gas into the air. Sometimes we can see the bubbles of such gases rising to the surface of lakes, released from the lake bottoms up through the water column. If the lake top is frozen over, you can poke a hole in the ice, light a match over the opening, bam, you get a methane explosion. The problem is that methane is over 80 times worse in terms of global warming than CO2. Methane that is being emitted from melting permafrost is a ticking time bomb ready to explode. And that sudden, intense release of methane gas could spin the Earth into what's called hothouse Earth. And that's a scenario we haven't seen since the time of the dinosaurs, when the Earth simply became too hot to handle for human life. Melting glaciers also destabilize our oceans, not only through sea level rise, but also due to the massive influx of fresh water into the salty seas. Our oceans have a delicate ecosystem balance of salt and fresh water. Oceans and related air currents circulate through the planet. This takes warm equatorial water from the middle of the Earth, and it runs it northward or southward through the Arctic and Antarctic regions, where the water cools off before returning to the equator. This is a natural oceanic and atmospheric conveyor belt AC system. Maybe you've noticed that most of Europe, for example, is on the same latitude as Canada, and yet it's not nearly as cold in Europe as it is in Canada in the winter. That's thanks to this global oceanic and balanced cooling system provided by the cold regions. As glaciers rapidly melt away, large volumes of fresh water enter the ocean, and this destabilizes that AC conveyor belt system. The ocean water circulation and air currents can become stuck in this scenario, leaving cold water and cold air in the polar regions and warm water and warm air near the equator. This can be tragic for regional climate systems all over the planet, sending the tropics into intense and extreme heat and regions like Europe into a deep freeze. So what can we do about melting glaciers? Can we save them? Can we do something to avoid the tragic events that will likely unfold as glacier melt continues to accelerate because of global warming? My book, Meltdown, The Earth Without Glaciers, is precisely about our changing climate and about glacier vulnerability. It's meant to awaken society to a new and altered world where one of our most obscure and yet most fascinating natural resources is going through colossal changes right before our eyes. We really are in a dynamic Anthropocene where human-induced climate change is entirely altering our climate. But as much as there is a tragic message to be told here, there is also hope. We can save glaciers, and we can slow, stop, and even reverse climate change. This anthropogenic era that we live in is one where our climate has been harmed by human activity, but it can also be an era where human activity can help repair our climate. The COVID pandemic showed us in mere weeks that this is possible. Remember when everything shut down? We were able to clear the air. Nature took a breather from our impacts. River waters cleared up. Wild animals roamed city streets. Fish returned to previously polluted bays. Residents of countries like Nepal and India were able to see the Himalayas for the first time in their lives. We cleaned the air by removing black carbon, one very significant pollutant that is destroying our glaciers. We did it then, we did it fast, and we can do it again. We stopped for COVID. We stopped as a society. Industry stopped. I mentioned this in chapter 10, but why haven't we stopped for climate? Why is that so? In that chapter, I team up with a young climate activist less than half my age to look at how different generations view this problem. And we discuss the dynamics that make people change their behavior and what it takes to make people do the right thing. As this book was published, world leaders gathered at what will probably go down as one of the most important global climate summits of history, COP26, held in Glasgow, Scotland. Climate scientists of the world have concluded that climate change is very real and that it's getting out of control. Time is short, they're telling us. We must stop climate change before the climate fully collapses and before glacier melt becomes irreversible. We may indeed have already passed these irreversible tipping points, but the message is clear. We can and must act now. We must act aggressively and decisively. I talk about this in Meltdown. Reducing certain pollutants like methane gas, black carbon, dirty refrigerants called HFCs, and smog are critically necessary in the short term to hold global warming to 1.5 degrees C. That was what the Paris Climate Agreement established as the threshold for Earth's warming if we are to avoid these catastrophic tipping points. As I wrote these very words on my way to Glasgow, global leaders signed a methane pledge to reduce methane emissions by 30% by 2030. Methane emissions represent about half of our global warming problem, and achieving methane emission reductions quickly is today the only pathway we have by mid-century to avoid a climate disaster. My purpose in writing Meltdown, The Earth Without Glaciers, was to draw attention to the predicament of glacier vulnerability and awaken society to their demise if we don't stop climate change soon. These magnificent displays of majestic natural beauty are phenomenal natural planetary resources that help stabilize our Earth's ecosystem in so many ways. I hope that through these pages, you will come to appreciate glaciers as I have, and that in your own way, you will also become a Creo activist to help protect our climate and protect glaciers for our planet and for the benefit of generations to come.